Hey guys, welcome back to another long sleepy wander through the past. Tonight, we're going somewhere cold and damp and probably a little smelly, so get comfortable, dim the lights and grab a blanket because you're going to need it. We're spending the night in the middle of a medieval winter. Now, when I say brutal, I don't mean the kind of winter where your Wi-Fi cuts out or your car won't start. I mean a winter where you could literally freeze to death before sunrise. The kind where food runs out, your water bucket turns into solid ice, and everyone in the village just quietly hopes they'll still be alive by spring. It's easy to romanticize medieval life. You know, knights in shining armor, glowing hearth fires, and hearty stews. But if you actually lived in the 1300s, a cozy winter evening probably meant coughing up soot, wearing 10 layers of itchy wool, and eating something called pottage, which was basically hot mud with hopes and dreams mixed in. Let's ease into this frozen misery slowly. In medieval Europe, winter wasn't just a season, it was a yearly endurance test. There was no central heating, no insulation, and if you were lucky enough to live in a stone castle, congratulations. You were basically living in a refrigerator with tapestries. Peasants had it worse, of course. Their homes were made of wattle and daub, which sounds cute, but really just means sticks and mud. The walls cracked, the roofs leaked, and when it snowed outside, it pretty much snowed inside too. Fire was the only source of heat, and it was a luxury. Wood wasn't exactly easy to come by in some regions. Cutting trees was labor-intensive, and transporting them took effort that most people couldn't spare. So, the poor gathered whatever they could: fallen branches, dried dung, peat, even straw. Anything that could smolder long enough to keep the chill away. And that fire? It didn't sit in a nice enclosed fireplace. It was often in the middle of the room, surrounded by smoke that had nowhere to go but up, or sideways, or into your eyes. That's why medieval homes always looked like someone had just burned a witch in them. If you lived in a manor, you might have had a fireplace, maybe even a chimney, though those were a relatively new invention back then. Before chimneys became common in the 12th and 13th centuries, people just cut a hole in the roof and prayed the wind wouldn't blow smoke back inside. Spoiler, it usually did. So everyone, peasants and nobles alike, spent winter half blind, coughing and smelling like wood smoke and wet wool. Now, let's talk about food, because if you think winter feasting sounds fun, medieval people would like to have a word. The harvest season ended in autumn. Whatever you stored then was all you had until spring. There were no grocery stores, no imports from warmer countries, and no refrigerators. Unless you count burying meat in snow as a form of refrigeration, which they kind of did. Grain, dried beans, root vegetables, and salted meat were the staples. But the real problem was variety, or the lack of it. By February, most people were surviving on barley bread, cabbage, and whatever root vegetables hadn't turned into mush. And if your food stores went bad early, tough luck. Starvation was a normal part of winter life. That's one reason fasting during Lent became popular. Partly religious, but also very practical. When your pantry was half empty by March, giving up food for God suddenly seemed like a convenient spiritual choice. Let's not forget about drink either. Water wasn't safe, especially in towns, so most people drank weak beer or ale all day long. It had just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, but not enough to make you forget you were living in misery. Now, let's float over to the sleeping situation, because this is, technically, a bedtime story. In a medieval winter, going to bed meant piling on as many people, blankets, and animals as possible. Privacy was not a thing. Families, and sometimes servants, all slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed, purely for warmth. If you had livestock, you might even invite them in. Cows, pigs, and chickens were like living hot water bottles minus the hygiene. It wasn't pleasant, but at least it kept you from freezing. And since there was no such thing as a bathroom, the chamber pot was your best friend. People kept one by the bed, used it at night, and emptied it in the morning, usually out the window. That's how winter mornings in medieval towns often began, with a splash of reality. But the real challenge wasn't just surviving the cold, it was surviving the darkness. In Northern Europe, daylight in winter lasted maybe 7 hours. People didn't waste candles. They were expensive and made from tallow, which smelled like beef fat and despair. So when the sun went down, that was it. The medieval world just went dark. It's believed people used something called segmented sleep. They'd go to bed after sunset, sleep a few hours, wake up in the middle of the night to pray or talk, then sleep again until dawn. So, if you wake up at 2 a.m., sometimes for no reason, congratulations, you're doing history correctly. Let's drift over to the nobility for a second. You'd think they had it easier, and in some ways they did. But being rich didn't always mean being comfortable. Castles were cold, those thick stone walls that looked so impressive in the summer. They trapped no heat in winter. The higher you went, the windier it got. Some rooms were so drafty that tapestries didn't just hang for decoration. They were basically insulation. Nobles slept in bedchambers hung with heavy curtains to trap body heat, sometimes even over the bed itself. They wore layers of fur and wool, and the truly fancy people had bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals that servants would slide between the sheets before bedtime. Romantic until you realize it occasionally set the bed on fire. Meanwhile, outside, life just stopped. Fields froze, rivers turned solid, and travel was dangerous. Roads became mud pits or sheets of ice. Only desperate people or messengers dared to move between villages. But despite all that, there was one silver lining: winter festivals. The bleakness of the season made people crave community, so they found reasons to celebrate. Christmas, Twelfth Night, and later, Carnival. It was a time for feasting, games, and mild chaos. Peasants got to drink, nobles got to show off, and everyone forgot for a night or two that life was basically a long, damp waiting game until spring. All right, let's ease to a close for this part. Medieval winters were cruel, but they shaped everything, from how people built their homes, to what they ate, to how they organized their lives around light and warmth. Every surviving tradition, the Yule log, the feast, even the idea of cozying up by the fire, comes from centuries of humans trying not to freeze to death. So, as you drift off tonight, wrapped in your blanket with the heater quietly humming, maybe spare a sleepy thought for those medieval souls, huddled by the hearth, staring into the smoke, hoping the winter wouldn't last forever, because for them, spring is coming wasn't a slogan, it was a prayer. Part 2. The Frozen Kingdom of Everyday Misery. So, you've settled in. You're probably under a blanket right now, maybe sipping something warm. Meanwhile, in the Middle Ages, the average person would have killed for what you're doing, because staying warm back then was a full-time job. Let's pick up where we left off. Medieval winters were, in a word, brutal, and not in the romantic snowfall over castle towers kind of way. More like your fingers might freeze while you're trying to milk the cow. Picture this. It's January, somewhere in Northern Europe. The year could be 1320 or 1420, doesn't really matter, they were all cold. The house you're living in is a small timber structure with a thatched roof and gaps wide enough for the wind to whistle through. Insulation? Not a thing. Central heating? Unless you count the family goat sharing body heat. No. Your main source of warmth is a smoky fire in the middle of the floor. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that kind of lets the smoke out. Except when it doesn't. So everyone coughs, wheezes, and smells faintly of wood smoke and despair. And it wasn't just the peasants. Even castles, those grand stone fortresses, were basically cold storage units with tapestries. Sure, lords and ladies had fireplaces, but stone walls don't exactly hold heat. They just echo the sound of your chattering teeth. At night, people piled into bed together for warmth. Families, servants, sometimes even animals. Privacy wasn't really a concept. And if you were unlucky enough to be single in medieval winter, well, you'd better have a really good blanket made of wool, fur, or questionable materials from a suspicious peddler who swears it's bare. Let's drift over to how people dressed. Layers were key. Wool, linen, and fur were standard, though the quality depended on your social rank. The wealthy had fine fur trims, fox, ermine, even squirrel. The poor? They made do with coarse wool that itched like crazy. Basically, everyone either looked like a walking carpet or a lumpy potato wrapped in fabric. Gloves and hats were lifesavers. Women wore wimples, head coverings that looked like the love child of a scarf and a napkin, while men had hoods or caps. And shoes? Forget waterproof. Most were leather, stiff as boards, and about as warm as cold mud, which incidentally was what you walked in most of the time. Food was another problem. Crops didn't grow in winter, so everyone relied on what they managed to preserve. Salted meat, dried fish, hard cheese, grain, and ale. Lots of ale. It wasn't just for fun. Water wasn't safe to drink, and alcohol helped prevent bacteria. So yes, people were mildly buzzed all winter, probably the only thing keeping them sane. Fresh vegetables. Rare. Fruit, only if you dried or stored it in honey. Vitamin C, practically a myth. It's no wonder scurvy popped up occasionally, even far from the sea. And if you think skipping one grocery trip is annoying, imagine your entire food supply depending on how much you managed to harvest 6 months ago. One bad summer could mean a very lean winter, or starvation. Now let's talk about the work, because of course you couldn't just hibernate like a sensible creature. Livestock still needed feeding, fires needed tending, and roofs needed patching before snow collapsed them. For peasants, the daily grind didn't stop. They had to mend tools, spin wool, carve wood, and haul water through freezing air. And all this while wearing the same damp clothes for days. Even nobility had winter chores. Lords had to oversee their estates, deal with restless peasants, and host endless feasts to prove they weren't freezing too. These banquets might sound glamorous, but remember, castles were drafty, and everyone was basically sitting around in layers of fur, eating lukewarm stew by candlelight. Ah yes, lighting. Another joy. The winter days were short, sometimes only 8 hours of daylight, and candles were expensive. Most homes relied on rushlights, thin reeds dipped in animal fat. They smoked, sputtered, and smelled awful. Basically, a medieval version of a flickering flashlight that keeps dying. Let's float over to hygiene, because you're probably wondering, how did they handle bathing in the middle of all that cold? The short answer, they didn't. In summer, maybe you'd bathe once a week if you were lucky or lived near a stream. But in winter, no way. Water was freezing, baths were a luxury, and nobody wanted pneumonia. People just layered on more clothing and prayed their natural musk would ward off illness. Spoiler, it didn't. By February, everyone smelled like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and old stew. Perfume wasn't just a fashion statement, it was survival. Now, illness. Winter was prime season for fevers, coughs, and what they called winter ague. Doctors, such as they were, blamed it on bad air or humours being out of balance. The cure, herbal teas, bleeding, or prayers. Sometimes all three, none of which worked, obviously, but it wasn't all misery. There were festivals like Christmas and the Feast of St. Stephen, where people ate, sang, and temporarily forgot about frostbite. Even peasants got a few days off to celebrate, though off usually meant more work preparing feasts for their lords. Entertainment was basic but communal. Storytelling, singing, dice games, and gossip. Lots of gossip. The medieval equivalent of Netflix was your neighbour telling you a scandalous story about someone in the next village who danced with the devil or baked bread on a Sunday, and for those who survived until spring, congratulations. You got to do it all over again next year. Still, there's something strangely cozy about it, isn't there? Everyone crowded around a smoky fire, wrapped in too many layers, sharing stale bread and laughter, because really, what else could you do? Let's float over to how the rich handled winter, because if anyone thought they could outsmart nature, it was them. Part 3. Nobles, furs, and frozen thrones. All right, so we've covered the peasants, the real MVPs of surviving medieval winters. Now let's glide gently up the social ladder to the people who were supposed to have it all. The nobility, the kings, queens, dukes, and duchesses who thought being rich meant being warm. Spoiler, it didn't. Castles might look impressive from the outside, but in winter they were glorified refrigerators. Stone walls, high ceilings, and giant drafty halls weren't exactly designed for comfort. You could light a fire big enough to roast an ox, and 10 feet away your breath would still fog in the air. So how did they cope? Furs. So many furs. The medieval elite were basically walking fashion statements made of animals. Ermine, mink, sable, fox. If it was fluffy, it was fair game. Kings would line their cloaks with ermine because it was white and symbolized purity, which was ironic, considering half of them were morally questionable at best. Noblewomen wore layered gowns with fur linings so heavy they could barely move. Picture yourself trying to eat dinner while wearing a carpet. That was court life in January, and because everything had to be a status symbol, the type of fur mattered. Squirrel, too common. Beaver, acceptable. Ermine, now your royal material. Now, about heating. Each room might have its own fireplace, but these weren't modern, cozy fireplaces. They were smoke-belching stone pits that heated one wall while freezing the other. Servants were constantly hauling wood, tons of it, and wood wasn't cheap. Even kings had to ration it sometimes, which sounds absurd until you realize deforestation was already a problem by the 1300s. At night, everyone slept under massive piles of blankets and fur. Beds had curtains, not just for privacy, but to trap body heat. A 4-poster bed was basically a DIY survival tent. Some nobles even slept in their daytime clothes, because changing in freezing temperatures was a hard no. And then there were the servants, who had to light the fires, fetch water, and carry chamber pots through freezing corridors at dawn. Imagine being half awake, holding a bucket of icy water, while your noble lord complains that his porridge isn't hot enough. Speaking of food, winter dining was interesting. Remember, there were no greenhouses or global trade routes bringing in tropical fruits. Everything had to be stored, salted, or pickled. By midwinter, even a royal table was looking pretty beige. Salted meat, dried peas, stale bread, and if you were lucky, a pie made of something unidentifiable but seasoned enough to hide it. To drink, nobles loved spiced wine, called hippocras, served warm. It was like medieval mulled wine, meant to disguise the fact that the wine itself had gone slightly bad. Ale was also popular, and beer eventually caught on, especially in Northern Europe. Everyone drank something alcoholic because, again, water was a gamble. Now about bathing. You might think the rich would have fancy baths, and technically, yes. Some castles had rudimentary bathing rooms with wooden tubs, heated stones, and servants to pour hot water. But doing that in winter meant hauling water, heating it for hours, and then sitting in a room where steam turned into ice on the walls. So many nobles skipped it. Just more perfume, more layers, and maybe a token rinse of the hands before dinner. Winter also changed the rhythm of noble life. Battles and hunting slowed down, and politics took center stage. Courts gathered indoors, full of scheming courtiers, minor lords, and nervous ambassadors, trying not to freeze while negotiating alliances. Feasting became the main entertainment. The Christmas season, especially, was an excuse for weeks of indulgence, music, jesters, minstrels, and too much food. It was less holiday spirit and more, we're cold, so let's eat until we can't feel our toes. Let's pause on medieval entertainment though, because it was unique. If you were lucky, your lord might host musicians or troubadours. Sometimes there'd be dancing, though in those heavy clothes, it was more of a slow shuffle. There were also board games like chess and backgammon, dice games and storytelling by the fire. And yes, they gossiped endlessly. Court gossip was the medieval version of social media. Everyone needed to know who was sleeping with whom, who was plotting treason, and who wore the same fur twice. But for all the luxury, the noble life had its own brand of discomfort. Cold floors, constant drafts, and the ever-present fear that your water supply would freeze. Even royalty couldn't escape the cold. There are records of monarchs holding court while wrapped in cloaks, gloves and hats, sitting beside enormous fires that smoked so badly their eyes watered. Some tried creative solutions. In France, nobles used metal braziers filled with coals to heat rooms, or just carried small ones under their skirts and cloaks. Yes, literal portable heaters, the early version of a hot water bottle, except it could set your outfit on fire if you weren't careful. One of the strangest things about winter court life was how little daylight there was. Without electricity, people rose with the sun and went to bed not long after dark. So during winter, days felt incredibly short. Nighttime was for candles, fires, and storytelling. The dim glow of torches flickering on stone walls must have made everything feel dreamlike, or maybe just claustrophobic. And while the nobility survived better than the peasants, winter was still an equalizer. Cold didn't care about your title. Kings froze. Queens got chilblains. Servants suffered frostbite. Everyone's nose was red, and everyone was slightly miserable. Still, there was a strange coziness to it all. The sound of crackling fires, the smell of roasting meat, the faint murmur of voices echoing in the great hall. Even in discomfort, there was a rhythm, one that people accepted as simply how things were. So next time you complain about your heater taking too long, remember, a medieval duke would have traded his title for a functioning radiator. Let's drift now to how winter shaped everything else. Work, travel, faith, and the strange superstitions that made long nights feel just a little less empty. Part 4. Faith, folklore, and frozen superstitions. Now that we've covered the physical misery of medieval winters, the frostbite, the furs, and the frozen water buckets, let's float over to the spiritual side of things. Because when everything outside your window looks like the opening scene of a bleak fantasy novel, people start turning to faith and folklore for warmth. Religion, of course, was the backbone of medieval life. Whether you were a peasant scraping frost off your bread or a noble wrapped in 10 layers of fur, God was the constant explanation for everything, including the weather. A brutal winter, that was divine punishment. A mild one, clearly a sign of favor. And when things got really bad, people didn't ask for a better fire. They prayed for forgiveness. Churches became the heart of the community during the dark months. Cold or not, everyone gathered there, not just for worship but for warmth, literally. The candles, the crowd, the incense, it all created a kind of human heating system. You can almost picture it. People packed shoulder to shoulder, breath rising in the air, the sound of chanting echoing against stone walls. And those long, dark nights were perfect for reflection, or anxiety depending on your perspective. Medieval sermons loved a good reminder that life was short, hell was real, and you could freeze or burn depending on your choices. So winter wasn't just cold, it was existentially chilling too. But not everything was fire and brimstone. There was also comfort in tradition. The medieval calendar revolved around religious feasts, and winter was full of them. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, each brought a reason to gather, feast, and remember that spring would eventually return. Christmas back then wasn't about gift wrap and Santa. It was 12 full days of eating, drinking, and pretending that the harvest hadn't been as bad as it probably was. The Yule log, a massive piece of wood burned slowly for days, wasn't just decoration. It was symbolic. Keep the fire alive, and you keep hope alive. People sang carols too, though they weren't always the cheerful tunes we know today. Some were downright eerie, more like chants than songs, echoing through cold chapels, as if the music itself was trying to warm the walls. Beyond religion, folklore filled in the gaps, because when nights are long, stories multiply. Winter was storytelling season. After all, when you can't work the fields, you might as well terrify your family with tales of spirits, witches and wandering souls. In Northern Europe, people believed that winter was when the barrier between worlds thinned. Ghosts, demons, and fairies were said to roam freely. The Wild Hunt legend was especially popular, an ominous procession of spectral riders sweeping through the sky, led by a god, king, or lost soul. If you heard their howling winds, you were supposed to hide indoors and hope they didn't carry you off. And then there were household superstitions. People hung herbs above doors, not for decoration but to ward off sickness and evil. Bells were rung to chase away storms. Bread was marked with a cross before baking to bless it. Every act of survival was mixed with a hint of ritual. Light played a huge symbolic role too. Candlelight wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Each flame represented hope against the darkness. During winter feasts, candles burned in every corner, not just for visibility, but as tiny beacons of endurance. And of course, not all folklore was spooky. Some of it was oddly comforting, like the belief that animals could talk on Christmas Eve, or that spirits of ancestors visited during Yule to check in on their families. So people left food out, not just for the living, but for the unseen guests. When we zoom out, you can see how winter shaped the medieval mindset. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about believing. Every snowstorm, every flickering candle, every cracked piece of ice had meaning. In a world without modern science, faith and myth filled the silence. Now let's wander over to another part of winter life that's often forgotten, the economy. Because as it turns out, you can't farm frozen soil. But that didn't mean medieval people stopped working. They just got creative. During the cold months, villages turned into workshops. Men repaired tools, mended fences, and made rope or barrels. Women spun wool, wove cloth, brewed ale, and salted meat. Children helped wherever they could, often by staying out of the way, and for some people, especially merchants, winter meant opportunity. Ice made rivers easier to cross, and frozen roads could handle carts better than mud. So trade didn't stop entirely, it just slowed down. In northern cities like Bruges or Lübeck, winter markets popped up. Traders sold salted fish, furs, candles, and all the cozy things people needed to make it through. Imagine a medieval Christmas market, except without lights or cinnamon-scented stalls, just cold hands exchanging salted cod for wax. Speaking of furs and wax, the candle trade was a big deal. Beeswax candles were expensive, so only the church and the wealthy could afford them. The rest of society made do with tallow candles, literally rendered animal fat. They smoked, smelled awful, and dripped everywhere, but they worked. Barely. And if you were poor, you didn't waste light. People rationed candles carefully. Once the fire went out, that was it. You either went to bed or sat in darkness, which explains why everyone in medieval Europe seemed to go to bed early. Not out of discipline, just out of practicality. There's something kind of poetic about that though, the whole world slowing down. People gathering closer, speaking softer, waiting for warmth to return. Even though it was hard, it had rhythm, predictable, cyclical, almost meditative. When you think about it, medieval winter wasn't just a season, it was a teacher. It taught patience, humility, and the value of small comforts. A bowl of hot broth, a shared fire, a candle that actually stayed lit. These were victories. Let's drift now toward how all of this, faith, folklore, and frost, shaped the idea of hope. Because even in the coldest corners of medieval Europe, people never stopped believing that spring would come again. Part 5. Thawing the Soul. Rituals, renewal, and the first signs of spring. So, we've survived the long nights, the frostbite, the half-frozen rivers, and the endless rationing of tallow candles. But eventually, the grip of winter begins to loosen. The days slowly get longer, the ice thaws, and you start noticing little signs that life is creeping back into the world. And just like every other brutal aspect of medieval existence, this transition came with its own set of rituals and customs, because humans have always loved a bit of ceremony, especially when they're freezing. Let's start with the obvious, the weather itself. The first crocus pushing through the snow, the smell of damp soil, and the returning song of birds weren't just nice to see, they were divine signals. Medieval people took these signs very seriously. If the birds returned early, that meant good luck for crops. If the snow lingered, well, brace yourself for another round of famine and cold. People read nature like a book, often with more superstition than science, but it helped them feel a little control over the uncontrollable. And speaking of control, let's float over to the first rituals of renewal. Candlemas, celebrated on February 2nd, was one of the earliest spring is coming festivals. It was a Christian holiday, sure, but the traditions were a mix of old pagan practices and religious symbolism. Candles were blessed to keep the light going strong, both literally and metaphorically. People carried candles in processions, marking the end of the dark season. It was kind of like a medieval energy drink, except with wax and prayers. Spring cleaning also has roots here. As the snow melted, houses were scrubbed, windows opened, and the soot of months of tallow candle smoke was swept away. Some historians say it was practical, but it also had symbolic meaning. Clearing out the old, the stagnant, the cold. It was a tiny act of hope in a world that had just endured months of frost and scarcity. Let's not forget the food. After months of salt, dried meat, and whatever root vegetables survived the winter, people craved fresh produce. Early spring herbs like chives and leeks were considered almost miraculous. and bread made from the first new grain of the season. Sacred. The first tasting of fresh crops wasn't just nourishment, it was celebration. Religious ceremonies tied to agricultural renewal were also widespread. In Northern Europe, processions called Plough Monday marked the resumption of farming after winter. Teams of oxen were blessed, ploughs were purified, and villages collectively acknowledged that spring meant work, lots of work, but also life returning. It's a reminder that even when survival seems impossible, humans find ways to ritualize resilience. But survival wasn't only physical. There were psychological renewals too. People told stories of the winter's horrors, but now they could laugh, quietly, and only after church, about the frostbite, the failed harvests, and the frozen ale. Shared experience, even when painful, built bonds. Those bonds made the return of warmth and light not just bearable, but emotionally restorative. And then there was the social aspect. Weddings, markets, and fairs restarted. Communities came alive with new energy. Imagine a medieval town that had been silent under snow for months. Now, children are running, merchants are shouting prices, bells are ringing, not just signaling time, but signaling life itself. Spring wasn't just a season, it was the reawakening of society. In some regions, the thaw also brought out more creative rituals. In parts of England, people celebrated Hocktide, where men and women engaged in playful teasing, sometimes mock capturing and ransom rituals. It was part fun, part symbolic act of reclaiming joy after winter's oppression. Think of it as a combination of community therapy and early role-playing game. And what about animals? Well, livestock that had been huddled in barns finally ventured out. Sheep, cows, and pigs, which had been surviving on stored fodder, could graze again. For medieval peasants, seeing animals healthy and moving was a massive relief. One less worry in a world where almost everything was a survival risk. It's also worth noting that spring wasn't instantaneous. The first thaw might be mild, deceptive even. People had to remain cautious, especially with crops. Planting too early could ruin everything if a late frost hit. So patience remained a virtue, even in hope. Medieval life was never about instant gratification. And through all this, humans maintained a subtle humor about their plight. After months of hardship, jokes, dry, sarcastic, and often grim, circulated. Better the frostbite on your toes than the plague in your nose, one might say, if they were trying to lighten the mood. Humor, even quiet humor, was a survival mechanism as essential as firewood or salted pork. By late spring, the full cycle of renewal had begun. Trees budded, rivers flowed freely, and roads once impassable with snow became conduits of commerce and gossip. Life continued, fragile yet persistent, proving that even the harshest winters could be endured. And while we, sitting comfortably and imagining this world, might find it a bit tedious or bleak to those living it, every thaw was a victory. In the end, medieval winters were brutal, but they were also rhythmic, almost meditative in their harsh predictability. Survive, ritualize, wait, and then celebrate renewal. It's a cycle of endurance that shaped not just the body, but the medieval soul. Part 6. Chilled Minds and Warm Fires. How medieval art and stories reflected the cold, now that we've survived the long stretch of winter and celebrated the first thaws of spring. Let's float over to how medieval people reflected these experiences in their art, literature, and personal lives. Because of course, even in a world dominated by survival, humans found ways to document, dramatize, and sometimes exaggerate their hardships. First, let's talk manuscripts and illuminations. Those painstakingly hand-copied books didn't just record religious texts. They often included marginalia, those little doodles in the margins. And guess what many of them depicted? Freezing peasants, frozen rivers, snow-laden landscapes, and animals struggling against the cold. It was almost like the medieval equivalent of posting a photo on social media with the caption, "Still alive, barely." These images were simultaneously cautionary, humorous, and oddly comforting. They reminded readers that everyone suffered through the same cold misery. Poetry, too, captured the essence of frost and snow. Winter was often described as a cruel, unyielding presence, a necessary antagonist in the human story. Yet it wasn't always grim. There was a subtle irony in much of the verse, sometimes poking fun at those who claimed expertise in surviving winter while freezing in their drafty homes. Medieval writers had a dry humor about the season, not unlike the snark we enjoy today. Now, let's drift over to personal diaries and letters. While not everyone was literate, nobles and some middle-class individuals documented their experiences. They wrote about frozen wells, treacherous roads, and food shortages, often adding side comments about neighbors who hoarded more than they needed, or children who caused mischief to stay warm. These little human touches give us a sense of daily life, both the struggle and the subtle comedy that came with surviving another harsh winter. And then there was architecture, which indirectly tells us about winter's brutality. Stone houses, thick walls, and narrow windows weren't just aesthetic choices. They were functional, designed to trap heat and withstand icy winds. Hearths became central hubs for both warmth and social life. Families would gather around the fire, telling stories or singing quietly, preserving a sense of humanity against the bleak white landscape outside. We should also consider how winter influenced seasonal festivals in art and literature. Many plays, poems, and religious pageants depicted the season symbolically, often as a metaphor for hardship, moral testing, or purification. Winter was the antagonist, spring the reward. Villagers attending these performances could relate. They had lived it, endured it, and now could enjoy a small narrative of survival and triumph. Even food practices reflected the harshness of winter. The preservation of meat, fish, and vegetables wasn't just about nutrition, it was art. Salted, smoked, or pickled goods became subjects of pride. Recipes in manuscripts often included advice about storage, frostproofing, and long-lasting techniques. The meticulous care required for survival created a form of cultural expression, a record of knowledge, ingenuity, and persistence. Animals also appear repeatedly in medieval art as symbols of endurance through winter. Horses trudging through snow, dogs huddled near fire, and cattle in thick straw became recurring motifs. These depictions weren't just decorative, They reinforced the reality that life continued in all forms. Despite the harshness, literature for children, or what passed for it, also reflected seasonal hardships. Stories warned young readers of the dangers of frost, hunger, and treacherous roads, sometimes adding humor or fantastical exaggeration. You might read about a boy who skated across a frozen river and narrowly escaped falling through, or a mischievous fox using the snow to its advantage. These tales were educational, entertaining, and crucially, comforting. They reinforced community knowledge about survival while making the cold season slightly less terrifying. Even music was influenced. Winter-themed chants, carols, and songs often portrayed longing for warmth, family, and the return of light. Monks, traveling minstrels, and townsfolk all contributed to a shared cultural understanding of the season. It's fascinating to think that the same chill that froze rivers also inspired melodies, meant to soothe the human spirit. In short, medieval art, literature, and personal documentation weren't merely aesthetic or academic. They were practical, therapeutic, and slightly humorous ways of coping. The cold was omnipresent, but humans found ways to reflect, ritualize, and even gently mock it. The combination of survival, creativity, and subtle sarcasm is remarkably relatable even to us today. Sitting cozy and imagining a world where frost dictated almost every decision. By understanding how people recorded and processed winter, we gain insight into the medieval mind, resilient, observant, and capable of finding small joys and humor amid hardship. Every drawing, poem, or manuscript entry is a quiet testament to endurance, a whisper across centuries that even in the harshest conditions, humans sought warmth in art, stories, and shared experience.